thank you for being with us again to kick off the 2021 Happy Hour series. For those of you who are new to this type of series, my name is Danielle, and it's a very simple type of series for you guys, but just a few things before we get started is if you do feel comfortable to turn on your camera, please do. It's so much easier to talk to faces than it is to talk to black screens. No pressure, but if you do, I encourage you to do that. And then as well, if you could stay muted throughout the event tonight, unless Dan is talking back and forth to you, that'd be awesome, just so that we don't have the background noise. It gets hard with a lot of people and their dogs barking and all of that. So you could stay muted, that'd be awesome. We encourage questions, comments, everything like that. The chat is always perfect for that. For those of you who know that, you guys do that great, and it helps us talk back and forth too when you guys are communicating through the chat. So, and then just a quick thank you to Davidsons. Thank you so much for being with us again through 2021 through these virtual series. And especially a thank you to Dan, who is Davidson's new spirit specialist. So I don't know if you guys have been to the store and seen his face, but you'll start seeing him a lot more at the store. And this is a great way for you guys to get introduced to him. So without further ado, I will hand it over to him and he can get us started.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much, Danielle. And I'd just like to thank the HRCA so much for doing this with us and so much for having us on. I really love seeing everyone's faces without their masks. It's just so interesting. And so tonight, I just wanted to talk briefly about all my favorite whiskeys that I've just liked over the years, kind of what's happened with the vintages over the years, especially with Angel's Envy, changing the type of cask they're using, all that's for there. And so let's start just with ice. And you saw in the pamphlet, there's something about optically clear ice. Making optically clear ice is not overwhelmingly difficult. So I made a very thin piece because I didn't have much time to actually make it. This is an insulated container, which I cut the head off of so I could get, everything out of. And you pretty much just fill it full of water. It doesn't even have to be filtered water. It can be just tap water. You put it in your freezer, and it will freeze from the top of its surface all the way down. And you can get very large pieces. I only have this in there for about 6 hours because my experiment broke last night. And so I scrambled this morning to get this done. But this is just what it made. So as you can see right through it. It's very clear. Very easy to handle as well. And so what I do when it is this thick is I make ice sticks from it. Take a knife, simple knife, score it where you think about you're going to want it, and then come on, crack. Usually cracks in one, but sometimes it takes a couple more. There you go. So you should be getting nicer pieces than this, but little pieces kind of like this across the board. And so I just save it in my little container, and we have lots of ice. So if anyone is ever trying to get those nice big clear cubes, just give it about 24 hours, 48 hours in the freezer with a vessel like that, and you should get that's what I've been looking for. So this is perfect for highball cocktails. It's perfect for really anything. These are some of my favorite things, especially when you're tasting whiskey, because it is filtered when you do it like this. So I really do recommend having fun trying it, picking up some from the store. It's really a fun experiment to do by yourself, and it always is something cool to do. All right, let's talk about whiskey. So when I taste whiskey, I usually taste out of a Glencairn cup. Glencairns are perfect. You'll notice the shape is kind of like a torpedo shape. That's to bring all the alcohol inside of the glass from the base, kind of in and up to your nose, so you're smelling the entire profile of the whiskey. So when you are tasting, if you can get a Glencairn, they're about $5 a piece. I recommend it. It's a great way just to kind of change how you're smelling and tasting whiskey. Let's start with the whiskeys. I tasted these in different orders last night, and so we're going to taste them with the one I kind of liked. So Woodford Reserve is going to be our first guy. So over the years, Christopher Morris is the master distiller for Woodford Reserve. It is a Brown-Forman product. So all of their barrels are toasted before they actually go into the charring process. So this brings out a lot of the inner sugars from the surface and then allows it to char, which gives it a little bit more complex flavor. I feel like it brings out a little chocolate, a little bit of orange in there. And so let's see what we're dealing with on the nose. When you're tasting whiskey, I recommend never going above the actual center of the bevel, no more than about an ounce at a time, just because you don't want to have, one, too much whiskey that you're trying to taste at once, and you'll start to lose some of the alcohol notes that you're going to be getting up through the glass. And so let me bring my screen up a little bit. When you're tasting, I recommend bringing it up to your nose, giving it one smell, going back from it, because usually it's going to be very alcoholic smelling. You know, give it just a second on your palate, come back to it, and then you really will get the fruit. And so right there, like I said, a lot of orange, a little bitter chocolate in there. Really great stuff. So usually by the third smell, I'm really getting all you're going to get off the nose. You can kind of get your notes. What is everyone smelling here? Type in what everyone is smelling just on your first go out the head. So citrus is usually what a lot of people say. Orange, citrus, nutmeg. A lot of those flavors are going to pull through in Woodford just because they have kind of honed their mash bill. It is 73% corn, so you get those really rich, sweet notes, but you also get some very heavy, a little bit of caramel, a little bit of toffee in there. Really nice, just kind of a starter whiskey, you know, for your evening. Spice. I love spice notes off the nose. It's really just absolutely phenomenal. And then the last part when you're tasting whiskey is always going to be its finish. So when I taste, I always try to let it mull around for a second. And so off this one, I get a nice long kind of warming finish. And that's usually imparted to the malted content because it is a 10% malted barley. And it is counted to the time it spends in the barrel. So this is a minimum, I believe, of 8 years to be called the standard Woodford Reserve. And so it just has such a nice, warm backing on it. You know, for a whiskey under $30, it really delivers a lot of high notes. Yeah, it's interesting. The finish on this one, at least tonight for me, has a little bit of spice to it, a little bit of some definite nutmeg. Really, really enjoyable. So that for those that don't know, Woodford Reserve was started back in 1945. It was taken over by Chris Morris as master distiller in 2008. And he has pretty much reworked the craft. They brought in a new secondary blender, forget her name, but she's doing a lot of very interesting products from them. So she's doing the wheated whiskey. I believe that she was the one that came out with the Baccarat series. So Woodford is really expanding their profile, expanding what they're trying to do, taking things a lot older than they used to. Just phenomenal whiskey, really. Sanso. All right. Next up, we're going to go for the nicer whiskey. This is what I consider nicer whiskey. Angel's Envy cast strength, or Angel's Envy regular port finished whiskey. Now, let's talk a second about the ABCs of bourbon. Bourbon is an American-made product. Can't make it anywhere else. You can take 51% corn, distill it all over the world. If it isn't made in America, it is not bourbon. B, barrels. It has to go into a new charred oak barrel, which is where this starts to kind of change up how we've thought about bourbon. C is corn. Corn has to be at least 51% of the mash bill to make up bourbon. So you can't do anything high rye or 80% rye, like some stuff we see on the other side of the shelf. This stuff has to be 51% corn. What do you do with the rest of it is up to you. Whether it has wheat in it or roses, predominantly rye and malted barley. So you kind of go through what makes a bourbon based on its mash bill, and you can taste it based on the sweetness that you get from that half corn component. D is distillation proof. Coming off of a still, you can be no higher than 160 proof or 80% alcohol. That's for two reasons. One, people start stripping flavor and grain flavor out at those higher proofs. That's why vodka is taken off the still at 190 proof, because that's going to be the cleanest, most effervescent, easy drinking alcohol, but is not going to be the best tasting. A little bit lower proof gives you a nice, really developed grain flavor. The second reason for bringing it off the still that you usually only go through 2 distillations inside of whiskey distillation. One is solid separation, and the other is high separation. If you get too high, you can start burning your initial malt and wash. So if you start burning that wash, you get a terrible flavor, very tannic flavor coming off that still. And that's not what people want. E is entry proof. Going into the barrel, you can be no higher than 125 proof or 62.5% alcohol. There's 2 reasons for that. If you put in too much alcohol into a barrel, it will age too quickly and it will pull bad flavor out of those out of the staves. If you bring it out at too low of a proof, it will start to go bad inside the barrel because you don't have enough alcohol to keep disease, bacteria, all that from touching the whiskey inside. And so you need to keep it at 125 to about 120 proof to keep your whiskey really aging properly inside of a barrel. And then G is genuine. Most important part about whiskey is you can't add anything to it. The second it comes out of that barrel, it's bourbon. You are not allowed to add color. You're not allowed to add flavor and call it a bourbon. So those are the ABCs of bourbon, which is where Angel's Envy port finish bourbon is a little interesting because it's not a new charred oak barrel. So if something's not a new charred oak barrel, can we call it bourbon? I want to say yes, because they took everything that makes a bourbon great and they finish it in a barrel for 10 months, and it just makes it absolutely phenomenal. Lincoln Henderson has been with Angel's Envy for 40 years, and he's actually one of the first people to start taking bourbons and rye and start finishing them off in different casks other than just the cask that it initially started. And this definitely revolutionized a lot of stuff with the bourbon industry, that people started not really knowing that the taste of it was sweeter, knowing that the taste of it was more complex. It went into different cocktails. It started changing how people really started looking at bourbon because it was a much more premium, complete product. So no further ado, let's try it out. So between tastings, usually I just take a little bit of room temperature spring water, glass, swirl it around. If you need some water, drink some water. Always important to stay hydrated whiskey tastings. So again, no higher than the center pin. Swirl it around, give her a little air. So I always noticed that the first nose on Angel's Envy is a little dull. I think that's from the port finish. I think it smooths out so many of those high alcohol notes that, yeah, so I get a little bit of raisin, get a little bit of toffee on my nose, but it's real subtle. So I always notice with Angel's Envy, it's real subtle. Now the mouth is amazing on it. I mean, it's just so buttery when it's going down from the finish that I almost can taste coconut, taste a little bit of, taste some rye, taste some nice sweet gingerbread kind of spice notes. Phenomenal stuff, just absolutely phenomenal. What's everyone kind of smelling off of it? I'm just curious because, I mean, the nose is probably the most interesting part, that it's such a complex whiskey on the mouth has such a abrupt and just completely stone fruit finish that the spice is so interesting. Yeah, definitely some plums, nice sugar dates in there. Really interesting is just kind of your base Angel's Envy. I know they have the rye, they have the cast strength. All of it's really great, but it definitely has such an interesting, sweet and smooth taste to it that I could never say anything bad or wrong. Now let's take it to what I consider my favorite distillery. I'm a little biased. I've visited it several times. I've met the master distiller. I'm friends with one of the assistant master distillers. Four Roses Yellow Label, or White Label, depending on when you saw it first. So I know it is Yellow Label because that's when I first started drinking Four Roses. Now they're on to what I consider more of a white label. But this stuff is phenomenal. So if you don't know much about Four Roses had Brent Elliott take over its master distilling back in 2005. He changed stuff up just a little bit. So he went from having the 10 mash bills be 3 different mash bill recipes to having the 10 different recipes be 2 mash bills. So he does a high corn, which is a 70% corn, 15% rye. 70 corn, 70% corn, 15% rye, 15% malted barley. That is their high corn recipe for Four Roses. Now they have a ton of different yeast strains. The yeast strains change a lot of different things. They only select a few for like the small batch select. They only select 1 or 2 for the small batch of just the regular small batch. And so this one is made from an amalgamation of all 10 of the recipes. And so if you're ever interested, look it up. It's very interesting how they kind of do the aging, how they do the statements on there. It's phenomenal. I say that Four Roses probably does one of the best jobs of any large producing distillery. I know that tons of people that use it in their blends use Four Roses just because it's so stable and because they have the recipe system completely nailed down. They're able to bring you out something that you know you're going to like. Like, hey, I need this mash bill and I need it to taste pretty much like this for it to complete my recipe, and they will bring it to you. And so it's one thing that I find just absolutely amazing about Four Roses is how complex their whiskey is, how phenomenal it is, and how relatively cheap it is in comparison to a lot of things out there. And so this is probably one of my favorite drinking bourbons. I always keep it behind the bar. If you're ever just going to a party looking to impress but don't want to spend too much, this is the bourbon to bring. Try it out. All right, this time I'm not going to say what's on my nose. I want to see what everyone else's nose is telling them just on the beginning. Just what gives it off, what type of finish do you get on your nose. I want to hear it before I say it. Let's see it. On right in. Because I get dates and plums. Dates and plums are the absolute epitome of Four Roses. It's all those really heavy, rich fruit that you enjoy drinking. It has that absolutely amazing nose finish on it. It has a wonderful almost a little peachy on the nose. Really great stuff, especially if you're drinking in summertime over ice. It's phenomenal. It is just one of the epitome bourbons for me. The mouth is a little bit, has those earth notes, a little bit of those kind of haze, sour safral oil notes. Just really kind of bittersweet with a little bit of cinnamon caramel in the end. It's abrupt, so it tastes like bourbon. You can taste that you have the bourbon in there, but it gives you just such a smooth finish because it's such an easy drinker, and you'll notice the color and the clarity on it is almost like Scotch, and that's just because it is a 5-year whiskey. It has not sat in the barrel for that long, and so it hasn't picked up everything you're going to get, but the new make spirit from them is so phenomenal. I would almost drink it white if they would sell it. And so one thing you can do when you've been tasting bourbon for a while is use your hands to kind of judge what you're doing. I like doing it with Four Roses because, excuse me, because you will be able to smell different spice notes, floral notes, and yeast notes within the tasting if you do it off your hands. So what I recommend for everyone is just take a little bit, just a very small amount, pour it on your hands, rub it together, briskly if you can, and smell it. What you get first is you should get a little bit of alcohol, you should get some effervescence, and that's usually your first nose. So you can usually tell what proof it is off the first one. Rub it again, just a little bit more. Stuff them together, and then you should be able to tell the grain note second. So if you have yeasts and you have rye, you have malted barley, you have corn, you should be able to smell it on that second round with your hands. Third round, you should get the yeast. So what I get off this is I get the herbal yeast that they use, which is, I believe it's lactobacillus, but I'm not sure. So the herbal one is phenomenal from them. And so I get herbal and I get a little bit floral. So you can tell they did an amalgamation of more than likely their recipe 2 and the recipe 4, just based on the yeast that I'm picking up, all the different kind of spice notes I'm getting. My guess would be it's probably a 2 and a 4, somewhere in there. And so that's what we're going to get to next, Wallace. So I want to talk about how to proof your whiskey for yourself. So there's a lot of purists out there. You got to drink it neat. If you don't drink it neat, you're not drinking whiskey. Okay, that's foolish. You should drink whiskey the way you like it. So if you like a little bit lower proof, add room temperature water. That will still keep the actual alcohol content lower while keeping the temperature of the whiskey the same so that you're allowed to smell and taste different things. Some whiskey is a little hot and you want to cool it down. That's when I recommend using ice. So actually for this little bit of Four Roses that I have left, I'm going to take one of my fancy little ice cubes. Okay, skip using the tongue because why not? I'm going to stick my fancy clear ice cube in there and just kind of taste with it. A lot of people say don't put ice in a Glencairn. That's just foolish. I do. Leave me alone. So you notice when you cool down whiskey, you get a lot of different flavor. So usually when I cool a whiskey down, you're going to lower its proof because it is melting a little bit. And you're also going to cool it down. So you're going to taste more of the fruits. You're going to taste more of the bitter. You're going to lose a lot of the toffee. You're going to lose a lot of the caramel, the warmer notes that you'll notice. You get a lot more cold, delicious, kind of fruity notes. So that's why I love Four Roses over ice. I think that because of the way they do their mash bills, because it has so much conciseness to it, that it is phenomenal stuff. Just absolutely phenomenal with little ice. It's usually my summer drinking bourbon. Any questions so far, guys? I know I've been talking a lot, but I know that, you probably have some notes you might have. You might be wondering about some of these bourbons. You might have actually some questions about them. I'd love to know right now before I move on to garnishes and other stuff. So here's the thing about identifying your palate and growing it over time. Growing your palate for me was tasting so many things over a long period of time and being able to compare it to other things that I had tasted before, that I was able to develop what I'm tasting and smelling on my palate. And it's different for everyone. Some people say, oh, it smells like pine needles, or some people might say that same note smells like forest, or some people that really drink a lot of whiskey might be like, that's rye. Yeah, it's definitely a high rye blend. And so some people just learn it by the grains. Like that's kind of where I'm at, where I learn a lot of my stuff by what grains I'm smelling and tasting. Some people learn it by what they learn when they're taught. So they'll be shown a couple bourbons and what other people smell from it, and they'll kind of gauge their palate from that. So I took the level 1 and level 2 sommelier course from the Colorado Spirits Association, and they are well stood up in the industry. They spun off of a sommelier group here in Colorado, and they all have wonderful palates, and all the teachers are such nice people, and it's not overwhelmingly expensive. If it's something that you are passionate about, you want to learn more about whiskey, I highly recommend taking. It's a 2-week class, and there's tests and live tasting and all that through the entire thing, and you learn so much while you're doing it. And I highly recommend it for anyone that's passionate about it, trying to learn just a little bit more about it. It's something easy in Colorado that you can do. Any other questions? Any other? You're welcome. I appreciate you, Joshua. Any other questions that people might have before we move on to making cocktails, how we want to prep all of our ingredients beforehand, so when we're making cocktails, when we're a little drunk, we don't mess up and cut ourselves? No? Perfect timing then. Got to the halfway mark, and we were doing good on time. All right. I'm going to bring it down so you're not going to see my face. Sorry. I'm going to just put this in the handy dandy sink for a second. And so these are the 2 main things we're going to be prepping tonight. I think there are easy ways and hard ways to prep things. I like to cheat. This is a peeler. If you have a peeler, I highly recommend it. It saves so much time. When you're cutting up an orange, you always try to keep the outside rind that holds all the essential oils and most of the flavor that you're looking for away from the rind, which is the pulpy white part in the middle. You don't want that. So easiest way to not have that is to just take your peeler, get it in there, and kind of wiggle it down as you're moving the orange. You'll get a perfect lemon twist or orange twist every single time, and then you'll still be able to use the orange. So give me a second. I'm going to do that kind of around all the orange and all the lemon really quickly. I did wash these beforehand, so no yelling at me. I did wash them. So flavor in whiskey vary greatly. So bourbon, of course, based on its corn content, will always taste a little sweeter than something like a Scotch or something like a high rye whiskey or Canadian whiskey, just based on the mash bill that you use. And so when I get different flavors out of bourbon, I get a lot of very rich fruits because it is a much heavier spirit, because the aging is done usually in Kentucky and mostly in America, where we have huge swings in our temperature and our ability to control that is very low, where a place like Scotland, it's very kind of dreary all the time, and so it doesn't allow for the constant expansion and contraction within the staves that we have here in America, where it gets below 30 and then up to 80, and that's what ages whiskey. And so a lot of people try to compare a 10-year Scotch to a 10-year bourbon. It never will be. A 10-year bourbon might as well be a 25-year Scotch. They do taste nothing alike. So you'll notice after I've kind of finished this guy off, some of them aren't going to be perfect. I just throw that away, but it's a perfectly good orange twist. Why not save it? And if you do a whole orange up like this, you're only making a few cocktails. I put this in some aluminum foil with a little bit of water, and it saves overnight, which makes it a lot easier for you the next day. So I'm just going to do the same thing with the lemon really quickly to get our lemon twist going. And always be careful. This is why I do this usually in the beginning of the night, because you never want to peel your finger away. Makes it tough. You'll always notice that my shaker is both my shaker and my juicer. So it's multifunction. So after you get done peeling your lemons, cut your lemons in half. Squeeze it down so you get as much juice as possible. I use fresh juice for all my cocktails just because I feel like the actual pulp and all of the flavoring that you get from that is much more rich and just easy to kind of digest and all that over using something like Minute Maid or something like Simple Time lemonade or orange juice. So I always recommend use some real fruit. It takes only a couple minutes to juice some stuff. And I said get seedless lemons, but I don't know if they exist. I couldn't find them anywhere. So all that will usually go to my compost tray, and this will go into compost, all the seeds and everything else. Try to save the environment as much as we can. And so usually I'll save this in these little tiny jigger jars that I have, but for tonight, because I'm going to use it all, I'm going to save it in shot glasses. So once you have juiced it, save your juice in there. I'm going to do the same thing for the orange really quickly. And remember, always keep your stuff on a work surface. You don't want to be cutting up your table. You don't want to be cutting up your finger. If you keep everything kind of consolidated, it will keep you much cleaner and probably keep whoever your mate might be a little bit happier. Yeah, these oranges didn't juice as much as I would have liked, so I might not get as much juice as I had hoped. Uh-oh. So if I have to use two, don't make fun of me. Oh, that's just sad. All right, we have orange juice, we have lemon juice. So let's start with the old fashioned, just because it uses none of these ingredients. So an old fashioned is made very simply. I use stir jar right here, stir spoon right there. Sorry if that was super loud, guys. And I take a large amount of ice. So you're not going to be actually working inside this glass. So this is not what you're going to be drinking out of. So use a large glass when you're doing this. Really quickly. When you're doing it, for the old fashioned, I decided on 4 roses being what I wanted to use. I think that because of its content, it holds up well, is pretty much something that uses nothing but the basics. This. And wherever my bitters may have gone. Sorry, keep my bitters in the fridge. I always keep my bitters in the fridge. They can go bad over time. I don't use much of it, so if I do use it, it's kind of rare. So I do use of course, the smoked orange bitters from Cocktail Punk. Phenomenal stuff because it has a little bit of that orange effervescence to it. It lends your cocktails just a little bit more orange flavor, gives it kind of like a Cointreau taste on it. Really phenomenal stuff. So I use just a simple jigger glass. It was made by Jägermeister. No one really cares. For an old fashioned, you're going to use 2 ounces of bourbon. You're going to use, with 2 ounces of bourbon, I like to use about 1/3 of a dropper full. 2 of them. 2 dashes usually for an old fashioned. Then I'm using Luxardo cherries tonight because that is what I have. Any cherries are really great. I love Star. I love Bada Bing. Personal favorites, Woodford. We are out at the store, but great cherries all around. And you will not be adding the cherry yet, but what I do is I take a full tablespoon of the actual juice, and while I am mixing the old fashioned, I mix it with the juice, and that's going to be a hefty amount of sweetness to it. So give it a little bit of a stir, not too much. You don't want to bruise the alcohol or anything like that. So that's why you don't shake it usually, is that you're just trying to maintain the flavors of the alcohol, you're maintaining the flavors of the cherry and everything else that goes into it. And for an old fashioned, of course, fancy glass. Fill it about yay high with ice. Stir spoon, pull out your cherry. Place gently, if you can, on top of ice. If not, it will sink like that. Darn it. Try to get it stick, didn't work. And then I have people that do either lemons or oranges as their garnish. I like oranges personally. So what I do is I just bend it as much as I can just to kind of get the essential oils going. And I place it in a cocktail. There you have a very, very simple old fashioned. Great for late nights, great for after the bar drinking. It's what I usually go to when I know I want something that I can remember tastes like the whiskey inside, but still has some very great flavors to it. Set that aside for the moment. All right. Next, you're going to need your shaker. It can be clean after you've juiced stuff in it. Being that we're going to be using the juicer and the juices anyway, I'm not going to worry too much about it. So, empty shaker. Fill about third full of ice. Doesn't have to be full of ice, just, about third full. Then we're going to do the bourbon cooler next, which is, of course, just orange juice and bourbon. We do have fresh bourbon, and so I use a different thief for juices than I do for bourbon, just so I don't mess up the taste of my bourbon. So let's see how much orange juice I actually was able to make. We have 1 ounce. And we have a ½ ounce. So we have 1½ ounces of orange juice. That's a little sad, but we'll deal with it. For this one, I chose the actual Angel's Envy. I thought that it lended itself nicely because it is pretty neutral. You have a question? So what do you mean by a topper? If you want to unmute yourself and just tell me what a topper is, I'll do my best to answer that question. Oh, so yes, a topper for me, I actually use absinthe. I know that sounds a little bit much, but I just use a spritz of absinthe right at the end. Really, really great stuff. Really, really great. Where was I? We're doing the bourbon cooler. So we have 1½ ounces of orange juice. I wanted 2, but we will use 1 full ounce of Angel's Envy bourbon. It's phenomenal stuff to go along with the bourbon cooler, just because its neutralness and its smoothness lends itself easily to the orange. And so with the bourbon cooler, I think the orange adds a little sweetness, but just for a little bit of added kick, I don't use a full one, but I use my little stir straw here. Just get a little bit of juice and just lace it onto the glass or onto the ice in there. And that's just going to lend a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of flavoring to it that you might enjoy in the end. So once you have your bourbon, you have that in there, cover nicely. So I give it at least 20 shakes usually, because that's usually when it starts tasting good. We are trying to bruise the alcohol. So I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but we are trying to make the alcohol dilute a little bit so that it actually increases its flavor profile relative to the orange juice that we are using. So for a bourbon cooler, I'm just going to use a very basic highball glass. About third much with ice, with the strainer still attached to your system. Start pouring her out. Mine is being a little bit finicky. Sometimes you gotta force it. There we go. So again, because we didn't have enough in there, it really was kind of a shallow drink. So I'm actually going to add another shot of bourbon. I'm going to use the stir straw, stir it up really quickly. Yeah, now it's about right. For garnish, I actually use a lemon twist. So I think the lemon peel and the lemon oils add a very, very interesting sweetness to it. Makes it kind of a full drink, nice bitter drink. And there we have a bourbon cooler. Any questions on that or anything else that we've been making lately? Okay, so we're asking old fashions with 7-Up, seltzers, other bubbly drinks, considered new style old fashions. I don't know. I would say it's closer to like a bourbon seltzer or an Americano, something that has some actual seltzer water in it. But I've had some bourbon seltzers that are actually phenomenal. If you've had like the pre-made ones, Cutwater is really great. I've had Monaco that actually has a Kentucky Mule that was phenomenal, which made me laugh a little bit because that came in a can. Any other questions so far? All right. So if you notice, I put a generous amount of the simple syrup in there. The simple syrup is the sweetener in there. I think because it's more of like a bitter, tart kind of sweet, it actually lends itself nicely to it because it allows you to taste the complete whiskey inside there, and it adds that kind of cherry flavor to it. But absolutely, that is usually the kind of go-to. I try to simplify my drinks because usually when it's late at night and you're making them, you really don't want to be busting out sugar cubes and waiting for them to dissolve. But some people, that's the way they do it. I like the juice because it dissolves nicely and it stays in solution. So as that cocktail sits there, it's still in great condition. So, I mean, it's just sitting there, it's not diluting itself, it's not dissociating within the glass. And so that's what I kind of look for. Because sometimes with sugar cubes, if they don't grind them properly or if there's anything left in the bottom, it can cause it to become a gritty cocktail. Any other questions? All right. So the bourbon cooler, you'll notice, didn't use bitters. That's your choice. You can add bitters, you cannot add bitters. I don't for my bourbon cooler because I add so much whiskey that I'm trying to have it taste like orange juice whiskey. And so that's completely up to the person at hand. All right, so we're going to toss this in the shaker. We are going to go for a whiskey sour. So just so I do this one 100% correct this time. About, again, third full. So let's find out how much lemon juice we have before we add the bourbon. 1 ounce. And again, a ½ ounce. So we have 1½ ounces of lemon juice. But you'll notice in the recipe that it's 2 to 1 on lemon juice to bourbon. And so for this one, we're actually going to use the Woodford Reserve. I find Woodford Reserve to be a phenomenal choice across the board for sour cocktails. So if you do a lot of whiskey sours, you do a lot of Sprite and bourbon or ginger bourbon, I think any of that lends itself nicely with the more sour and tart whiskey of Woodford. And so we're going to go for 3 ounces of bourbon to my 1.5 ounces of lemon juice. And you'll notice a lot of the time with the recipes that I produce, it is a ratio-based system. So like lemon juice is 1 part, whiskey is 2 parts. We got 1.5 ounces lemon juice, 3 ounces of bourbon. I try to keep the ratios consistent just so that you have kind of an easy recollection of what you're trying to make. Nothing too complicated. You can always play with those arrangements. For the whiskey sour, I use bitters. I always use bitters. It's not a dealer's choice thing for me. I think it tastes much better with an aromatic, a little punch. I use 2 full dashes. Actually, because it's 3 ounces, we're going to use 3 dashes. I think that you almost can't go wrong with it because there is so much sour. You need to balance that pretty completely with the bitter. So it took me a little while to get this recipe right, but this is usually what I keep in the glass. And so let's shake her up really quickly. All right. So you should get a little foam on top for these. I use martini glasses. This one was luckily provided for me by Ryan Reynolds. Thank you, Ryan. I don't use any ice in this. It's meant to be served kind of neat, kind of even. And so usually there would be a skewer, but I didn't have any skewers on my list. So then we garnish, of course, with a orange. So again, we do the small little twist. And then we place it in, finish garnish. With 1 Luxardo cherry. Man, I couldn't balance it. So I tried to balance it on the orange. It didn't work this time, but then I add a little bit of the juice in there in a swirl, and that gives it a very interesting color and context on the top of it. So you kind of get that interesting little pop of a swirl on top. I wish I could lean it down towards you so you could see it, but trust me, it's a little swirl on top. Any questions about anything that I've done so far? I know everything is kind of simple. I think of all my stuff as very classic and very simple stuff to make. If you can always make things more complex, you always can make things hard to make, but I try to keep it very simple, very quick, very easy. So you can make a bunch of them, and then when it's late at night and you might not be super functional, you can make it pretty easily. All right. Absolutely. Let's go back to ice really quickly. I love the question. So this is just your basic Coleman. I bought this at Home Depot this morning because my experiment failed last night. And so I woke up this morning and I kind of panicked. So I ended up going out, buying this, cutting the top off of it, putting the tape on it, putting water in it, and freezing it. And so what you need to do is, because it's exposed at the top and insulated on the sides, it causes it to freeze from the top of its surface all the way down to the bottom. And so if I left this in there for 50 hours, it would be completely iced. It'd be hard to get out, first of all. So just remember that. And you would have to let it melt for a little while, then pull it out. You'd notice 2 layers on there. Both layers, one is clear like this. And so you should be able to see through it almost perfectly. Sorry. And so you should be able to almost read through it like that. Coleman. And then you'll have an ice layer that looks opaque, just like kind of refrigerator ice. That opaque layer is solids. It's oxygen that's been trapped. And so that goes kind of down and down and down into the layers. And so you're going to want to chop that off, remove it, melt it, whatever you have to do to get rid of that component. And then you'll have some nice stuff. I was rushing this time, guys, and so we'll do a much better job. Next time, I promise I won't end up with something this thin. It'll be much, much thicker. But this is the process in which we make cold ice, or optically clear ice. So you can do any of that. So I actually did a lot of experiments through college on this, and you can use pH positive water, which is something that I do. You can use filtered water, spring water. You can use almost anything. The fact that you are using this methodology takes solids and oxygen and pushes it down through. So almost anything that's left is going to be a pretty purified water. So you're not going to have too many impurities. I've actually taken the clarified section, melted it, and tested its TDS, and it was only, I think it was 210 TDS versus the original tap water being almost 600. So it did pull solids out as it ran. So I think it's a very cool experiment and very cool process to kind of run through. Because, I mean, honestly, they can rip you off on clear ice. Clear ice is easy to make. Just takes a cut-off cooler and a little water. Any other questions, guys? All right. Being that we're here, I'm going to talk about a couple other whiskeys that I have on me. We're going to do a little Japanese stuff right now. I don't know if you've ever had the Yamazaki 12 year, but this is actually one of my favorite Japanese whiskeys. If you haven't had Japanese whiskey ever, it is a lot reminiscent of Scotch whiskey. It is 100% malted barley, phenomenal stuff. If you have had Macallan, if you've had Glenmorangie, Glenlivet, it's going to be very lending to that, but it's also going to be very stone fruit, very very peachy. It has a lot of those kind of high organic tannins to it. So I highly recommend, if you haven't gotten a bottle of this, we have a couple more in stock at Davidsons, coming in and grabbing a bottle before it is gone. Absolutely. Let's take a quick taste of this, then I will lend you over to Danielle. So Suntory's Shinji Otori is the master distiller and master blender, and has been the third generation of him. He was the one that, oh, sorry to tell you this, it's $129.99. It is an expensive one, but it's so worth it. Also, we have the Toki whiskey, which is a great one. This guy, I can absolutely hold that up to the camera. So that is the Yamazaki 12 year. Really, really great stuff. And we also have Hibiki Harmony in right now, which is phenomenal just across the board. We also have the basic Toki whiskey, which is a $35 blend from all of the three distilleries at Suntory, Chiya, Hakushu, and Yamazaki. And it's phenomenal. For 34 bucks, it's a great entry into Japanese whiskey. You'll also notice that the color on it is very clear, very clarified, and this has been aged for 12 years. So it definitely does get very interesting flavors. I mean, yeah, just all delicious plums for me. Peaches, plums, apples. There's all the really great fruit notes that you like, with almost no sallow, almost no bitter. It's phenomenal stuff. I'd say that Japanese whiskey is one of those things that you have to try by itself just to start, just so that you have something that you can kind of base your overall palate on, because it's such a different whiskey and it opens up your world. And it really does just change how you think about whiskeys. And we'll be doing a lot more on it. If you stay with me and you keep coming to these, I promise we'll be doing a lot more Japanese stuff as time kind of moves forward. And with that, guys, I just want to thank every single person that stayed with me, watched me make cocktails and mess stuff up. I really enjoy doing it for you guys, and I hope to be back soon to do this again with you. If you have any suggestions, come through Davidsons or write me at dans@davidsonsliquors.com and just let me know what you thought of the presentation. Let me know what I could do better. I really appreciate everything. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to hand it over to Danielle at HRCA. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being with us tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed the cocktails and some great bourbon knowledge. So thank you so much for all of that. If you want to join us again, we have a lot of our series up online, but next week, or in 2 weeks, I'm sorry, in 2 weeks, we are going to have Katie back from Odell Brewing Company, and she's going to be talking on their wine project again, on some of their new ones that they have coming out, or that they do have out currently, that are now bottles of wine, and making a fun wine cocktail as well. So please join us for that. And then in 2 weeks after that will be our Valentine's Day one, and that will be back with Dan, and he'll be making some great Valentine's Day themed cocktails. So sign up for those, grab your ingredients, and thanks for being with us tonight. And thanks again to Dan and Davidsons. Have a great night, everybody.